Honored to introduce our special guest, Professor Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and at the Hoover Institution, and Professor by Codex of Sociology and Political Science, who will present Democratic Transition Reconsidered. This talk will last about 1 hour and there will be a question and answer section at the end. So if you don't mind, please hold your questions till the discussion time. For your kind information, a recorded version of this webinar will also be available on YouTube as soon as possible. So as the time comes to start our webinar, I'm glad to welcome you again, Professor, to deliver the speech and today's topic.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. See, you see my slide,
yes,
contemporary models of democratic transition. Is that visible?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
Okay. So I don't want to talk too long. My goal is to talk less than an hour, because I think it'd be good if we could have a conversation. I think it's a challenging moment that you're at now in Burma, to say the least. And well, maybe when I get through this presentation, we'll see glimmers of hope and we'll see the challenge more clearly. There basically have been, since the third wave of global democratization began in the mid-1970s, three types of democratic transitions, from above, from below, and kind of in between, kind of nonviolent struggle between regime and opposition, which led to a negotiated solution. Often the transitions from above, wind up being pretty successful. One of the most successful of them was the transition in Taiwan. The ruling party in Mexico in the 1990s deciding to extract itself, and in Spain in the mid-1970s, the military in Brazil between 1973 and 1985, organizing its own exit from power in a long process of political opening called the abertura, which is Portuguese for opening. And when the authoritarian elites, either individual rulers or ruling party or the military as an institution, are organizing the transition and regulating its pace and its character, and probably, frankly, writing its constitution, there are, it may get you in the end to a transition in which the military formally leaves power or the ruling party gives up power or whatever. But there are a number of risks here, as you now painfully know, since the transition that produced whatever it was that arose in 2015, it certainly wasn't a full democracy, but it was a more open constitutional system that was, very much planned and executed by the military. And what, a political power, as they say in the Bible, giveth, that power can take away. And the military did obviously do so, and granted itself a certain kind of fig leaf of theoretical legitimacy to do so under the Constitution. A lot of this then involves, the incentives that drive the authoritarian rulers to give up power and to adhere to the surrender of power. If you look at these cases, all of them took place in a world in which democracy was ascendant, the West was ascendant, the incentives were all toward, wanting to join the liberal international system, wanting to join the European Union, wanting to join the international trading system, wanting to have more open and dynamic societies, more foreign investment, and so on. And that not only generated in these rulers and ruling parties and military establishments a decision to at least gradually withdraw from power, but also a commitment to implement and sustain the decision and to respect it once they withdrew, because the cost of going back would have been too high in disrupting their international position and achieving the societal tranquility and economic dynamism and international positioning that the democratic transition was meant to bring about. If you have a situation where the incentive structure changes, then a lot of this can unravel, particularly if it was very tentative, and it was certainly at best partial and tentative in Brazil. And none of these democratic transitions that you see here had to contend with a world in which the biggest relevant power in their neighborhood was a neo-totalitarian regime, namely the People's Republic of China. None of them had to contend with a world in which the power of liberal democracies was in decline. And none of them had a military regime that had so thoroughly penetrated politics and society as the Tatmadaw had done. And indeed, in that case, then, the story of Pakistan is probably a better parallel, but we can talk about that later. The second model of transition is one where there's a balance of power between the authoritarian regime and the democratic opposition, particularly in civil society and in the opposition parties. And this means that nobody can really dictate the outcome. There's very significant mobilization of civil society, very significant international pressure often on the authoritarian regime. Typically, you see different political parties drawing together in alliances to challenge the authoritarian regime and draw together in electoral agreements. And so the authoritarian regime then realizes it can't impose its will, either by imposing the kind of transition and the kind of constitution that it would want, or by resisting transition altogether. And what happens here typically, and what we call pacted or negotiated transitions, is that the authoritarian regime, or at least moderate, soft liner elements within it, negotiates with more flexible and moderate elements within the opposition. And they come to agreements to narrow their differences and give birth to a new democratic order. So this is a very interactive process. It's often a very dangerous process in which threats of violence lurk from many directions. This was particularly the case in South Africa, but also El Salvador. And it can happen in various ways. The negotiations may be very rapid or they may be protracted. They may be driven forward by periods of mass mobilization from the opposition in society, and they may be set back by outbursts or threats of violence. Negotiated transitions are also not entirely satisfying because they have to make compromises in order with the authoritarian regime in order to get the autocrats out of power. And this means that they can't really challenge the existing economic structure, and often very corrupt authoritarian elites have to be allowed to keep their ill-gotten wealth, which is a very painful thing to concede to. And Democrats typically need to agree to, in essence, ignore the authoritarian crimes of the past, or at least not prosecute them, because the people who are responsible for them, particularly if the crimes happened not that long ago, are going to be the people who are ruling and deciding whether they want to give up power or not. Who's going to give up power if they think it means they're going to go to jail for their previous actions? So negotiated transitions involve compromises over the constitutional structure, which was the case in Chile, and obviously in some of these others, but also over other issues involving the distribution of power that may amount to very painful concessions in the near term. I will say that over time, if a democracy takes hold, these concessions may eventually be rolled back. And we've seen instances where some of these abusive autocrats were prosecuted in Latin America at a much later time. In any case, if it works, a negotiated transition gives rise to an underlying framework of what's been called consensual unity. That means elites unite around a new consensus on the rules of the game for competing for power. And they commit to accept those rules and those bargains and those restraints going forward. So each side develops some security in the future that their basic interests won't be obliterated. So this gives rise to a dilemma that I've already alluded to. A negotiated transition requires conflict, tries to resolve conflict, and it may do so too well, because if you eliminate all conflict, you're eliminating the basis of democratic contestation and disagreement, and you may get a very diminished democracy in which the bounds of what people can disagree on and contest over have been narrowed considerably. And therefore, democracy can be degraded by removing too many issues of consequence from public discussion and decision making. And this is why there's one reason why there's been so much discontent in Chile, a democracy we consider to have been a very successful and stable democracy, but which saw an outburst of youth and other societal discontent because they were unhappy with all the compromises that have been made with the old authoritarian order under General Pinochet. And there's a term for this problem of elite pacts. It's called birth defects. Fundamental deficits of democracy that are kind of baked into democracy from the very beginning, and that leave certain groups excluded, or certain groups having more power than they should have, or that are in some way unfair or disrespectful of the rule of law, which requires accountability for past crimes. To succeed, these negotiated transitions need to build trust between autocrats and democrats. This is something to keep in mind. This requires patience, empathy, repeated interaction, and frankly, confidential closed-door discussions. It's very hard for each side to make compromises if they're negotiating in the light of day, and their allies are watching what they're doing and may try and block it. Requires pragmatism, flexibility, a good strategy to at least work through the issues one by one and make incremental progress. And it really requires a broad and unified democratic coalitions, because if the democratic forces in the party system and civil society are not unified, then the authoritarian regime will play them off against one another. And it will just be too easy for the autocrats to completely dominate the negotiations. This also requires a capacity to mobilize society at key moments in periods of mass demonstrations. And in every instance where this has emerged, it has required the peaceful resolution of armed conflicts. You can already see the dilemma here in Burma in a few senses. Two that immediately come to mind are, first of all, you've got to have actors on the other side in the autocracy who for some reason are motivated to want to have a transition to democracy, and are motivated to at least begin a discussion. Then you have to find ways of building trust between the autocrats, or at least those who are willing to negotiate, and the Democrats. And when the autocrats have killed a lot of people, particularly recently, and locked up a lot of Democrats and subjected others to torture and so on and so forth, it's just not likely that you can get that trust. On the other hand, as I'll show you, armed conflict is not a very promising approach to achieving democracy. The third method of democratic transition is by peaceful mass mobilization from below, where literally the regime falls and is replaced. And you can see a number of instances where this has happened. Note that in most instances where military regimes simply fell, and it was the democratic opposition that was able to impose a new political order in a kind of revolutionary situation, there are basically two models here. One is a violent disintegration of the regime as a result of defeat in war. And this is what happened in Portugal and Greece in the mid-1970s and in Argentina in 1983. In Portugal, the military rebelled after Portugal was losing its wars in Africa to hold on to its colonies. And Greece lost its war with Turkey in the mid-1970s. Argentina lost the Malvinas-Falkland War. So defeat in war has a way of unraveling authoritarian regimes. The more common method has been a political development, usually an election, that the authoritarian regime loses, and then they try to rig the election, and that doesn't go well, and the society is able to show the electoral rigging and mobilize mass protest and basically bring about a democratic change. Or in some instances, the regime simply couldn't pull it off, was defeated in the elections, and then had to go. And you can see all those instances there. This model of democratic transition, the replacement model, which involves a rupture of the old order, usually happens rapidly as the regime is decaying and collapsing. And very crucially, it involves the security forces dividing, with at least a significant section of the security forces turning against the regime or refusing to intervene to save it. And let me say that one reason why they turn against the regime is because the society embraces them rather than mobilizes violence against them. When you have violent resistance, it tends to unite the security forces around the defense of the regime, and it hardens the security forces against the defense of the regime. So, I won't say this turns out to be the case in every instance, but generally, violence has been a very unsuccessful method of trying to achieve transitions to democracy. And strategic nonviolence, the mobilization of tactics of civil resistance and denial of compliance, has been a much more successful method, as with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in December of 2004, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Philippine, People Power Revolution in 1986, and so on and so forth. These color revolutions that I'm referring to now, they're not very relevant to the current situation in Burma, because you don't have, and I don't think the military is going to let you have, competitive elections. But I'll mention anyway what the common features were. They were electoral authoritarian regimes with some degree of pluralism in the media and among political parties. They had an unpopular incumbent who was running for re-election. They saw a united and organized opposition. Crucially, there was independent election monitoring, and the opposition could demonstrate through a parallel vote tabulation that the election had been rigged. There was independent and media able to publicize the regime fraud and the protests. There was truly mass mobilization. In many of these instances, you had 1 million people or more, as in Ukraine in December of 2004, on the streets of the capital city, and nonviolent and well-coordinated protests around the country. There was the use of social media and mobile communications to help mobilize people, and there were splits and defections in the security apparatus. So why does violence make democratic transitions more difficult? I've already alluded to the first one. It unites the security establishment in defense of the regime. And it's like if you're being fired upon in battle, you're going to circle the wagons and try and fight back. And this is going to preempt and defeat the possibility of pulling away elements of the military or authoritarian regime and provoking a split within the authoritarian regime, which is often the best means of getting a transition to democracy, is to have this split in the regime. Violence tends to alienate moderate and liberal elements of the political opposition and civil society. It polarizes society and makes it difficult to compromise. And just think of what happens when you have a turn to violence. It creates what's been called a commandist culture. That is a culture of military hierarchy and obedience to authority, and intolerance among the cadres of anything that defies central authority. This is, even if it succeeds, as it ultimately did in Zimbabwe, it's not a culture that's going to bring about a transition to democracy. It's going to result in a new authoritarianism. It generally creates new legacies of human rights abuses by the forces of the resistance, and it may bring about, as you can see in these some of these revolutions, may empower the worst elements within the resistance movement, very, very authoritarian and ideological elements. And it, if it succeeds in bringing down the regime, it could leave behind a shattered state, as in Libya. The problem is, again, that if you want to get a military out of power, you need to make, and you do it through negotiations, you need to make painful compromises. And, in this case, these could include no retribution or legal accountability for the crimes they've committed, a substantial grant of autonomy to the military and respect for its command structure. You need to understand the military, the way it thinks, and the way it conceives of national security. And you need to make sure that the military gets the equipment and resources it feels it needs to defend the country. Of course, the tragedy is in Burma, I think, out of weakness, the democratic opposition agreed to all these things, or essentially made these concessions, and it still wasn't enough. Over time, if you're going to build democracy, you need to have a strategy for reforming civil military relations that sequences reforms over an extended period of time. And at every period in time, this could happen over 20 years, you need to assess what are the military's concerns, what are its interests, what does it hope for itself and the society, how does it conceive of its role? And gradually, as you get old officers retiring and new ones emerging with new interests and possibly new values, you try and nudge them along in a more democratic direction. The first step is to withdraw the military from an active role in government and politics. Obviously, this would have involved, as we know, getting the military out of parliament, out of ministries, and out of a veto power over politics. But this, because of the superior power of the military vis-a-vis civilians, this just wasn't possible. Gradually, you want to withdraw the military from economic activity and limit their role to military matters. But the problem is where the military has substantial economic incentives to control power in order to extract wealth, this is very, very hard to do. And one can imagine that that could have been an important incentive for the tragedy that befell Burma. Ultimately, this is, I'm afraid, far into the future, but ultimately, reforming civil military relations in order to lock in a transition to democracy requires reforming military training and inculcating a new ethic and doctrine of civilian democratic control of the military. It requires separating the military from the domestic intelligence apparatus. So their goal is strictly the defense of the country against external enemies. And it means that civilians need to build up the knowledge, information, and authority to monitor military budgets, deployments, promotions, and gradually extend civilian control over the military. And ultimately, this would lead to a civilian minister of defense and civilian oversight over major military decisions, including weapons acquisitions. Now, I'll just say that, when you look at the causes of democratization over time, the situation today is not very encouraging. First of all, you don't want to wait for the failure of the authoritarian regime, either in an economic crisis or a defeat in war, in order to see it fall. Second of all, authoritarian regime success as a result of modernization and economic development, I think, is going to be a long time coming in Burma, and may not come because, for the obvious reason that the military is such a corrupt, predatory, and venal institution. It's hard to know how to foment divisions within the authoritarian regime. You might be able to recognize the divisions between hardliners and softliners when you see them, but it's a very hard thing to generate from scratch. And even if you think you know who the softliners in the military are, it's not clear how easy it is to manipulate or widen those divisions. And sometimes if you try to embrace moderates in the regime, you could undermine their situation and make it difficult for them to survive. Globalization over time changes norms in a better direction, but in an era when the most powerful global actors, at least within Burma's region, are authoritarian or neo-totalitarian actors, and those are the international actors that are bringing pressure, bringing money, bringing infrastructure, bringing business, bringing engagement. Ooh, that's a bad situation too. It's a very, very bad situation. Ultimately, autocrats do face a dilemma. If they succeed, they generate economic development with rising demands for democracy. And it doesn't mean that they'll be overthrown immediately, but it does create dilemmas for their survival. And of course, if they don't deliver, then like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and so on, they've got a losing proposition in terms of domestic legitimacy. It doesn't mean they will, they'll fall immediately, but uh, they they'll be in trouble. Now, I'm not going to talk about China now. I think that'll take us off the subject. But let me just say, and then I'd welcome the engagement with you. That's what I was really looking forward to. You're in, you're in, you don't need me to tell you, you are in a very difficult situation, because the balance of power globally is very different now than it was, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when it appears the last time that the military may have taken a decision to embark on this path of political opening. And the democracies of the world are weaker now, the autocracies are stronger, and so on and so forth. I don't know what the dynamics within the regime are, but I think that the last time, I certainly got the impression that the military did not want for it or the country to be extremely dependent on and completely manipulated by the People's Republic of China. They wanted Western engagement in order to balance off against China and protect Burma's autonomy. And that still is a kind of lever that you should be mindful of and try and play. And if the society remains resistant to Chinese domination and wary of Burma's place in the world, that is something that you might be able to invoke or engage as an incentive for the regime to reach out to the Western democracies of the world and Asian democracies too, like Korea and Japan, and reduce their the country's dependence on the People's Republic of China and maybe other authoritarian actors. Unless there is a prospect of overthrowing the regime that I am somehow missing and do not see, ultimately, the path back to some kind of limited constitutional system is going to run through negotiations. Now, you should be thinking about how you can turn up the pressure on the military through domestic and international action that makes their life difficult and that creates a plausible path back to negotiations. But you need to think clearly about whether there is any other path except a path of negotiations, because at this point, with the balance of power, sad as I am to say it, I don't see it. And again, the question of violence looms as a potential negative factor. I might say as well, it's extremely important to keep the cause front and center in the minds of Democrats around the world, and to try and keep Western pressure on the military regime to open up, because without that, I don't think it's going to happen. So let me stop there, stop screen sharing, and welcome your comments. Hello?
Hello.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. Hello, Professor. Yes, thank you very much for the great talk. So, dear all participants, now is the time for a question and answer session. And please feel free to ask any question you have. So you can raise your hand or send your questions in the Q&A box of this webinar platform. So we truly value of your privacy and security concern too. So, but we have already got like some questions from the participants and sent to us. So, Professor, please let me read out some questions for you.
Yeah, I see them.
Okay, so number one question is like, with the rising power of undemocratic but economically more powerful regimes like China, Russia, and Iran, Western democracies, especially US, is too busy to deal with. What would be the opportunity structure for Myanmar's democratic movement?
Well, the good news is that people in the United States still care a lot about Burma, Myanmar, whatever you want to call it. And it remains important emotionally to us. We continue to identify with your historic struggle. I think the cause of democracy in Myanmar was seriously tarnished by the campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya and the failure of Aung San Suu Kyi to stand up against that and stand for human rights. This was a very bitter and painful disappointment to many of us. But notwithstanding that, of course, we feel outraged that she's been imprisoned, that there are so many political prisoners, that people have been killed, and so on and so forth. So, you know, the great American civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, had a saying, keep hope alive. And I think this is very important. You never know when circumstances are going to change, when the balance of global power is going to change. And so you have to maintain your advocacy internally within the country and externally in relations with other capitals, because you never know when the moment may come. Now, you know, the US government and society remain deeply attached to Burma and, you know, deeply committed to restoring a constitutional order there. But the United States is not the only relevant actor. I think you need to work on public opinion in Japan and Korea and you know, other democratic societies in the region. One of the things that I think you should bear in mind is that to the extent that the military needs to throw in or decides to throw in its lot with the People's Republic of China and kind of sell out the country to Chinese influence, it will not only provoke a backlash domestically, but it will provoke a backlash internationally as well. And it will enable the national unity government and other actors representing democratic forces in Burma to help rally international opinion and engagement. And even if we go through a period where US influence is eroding somewhat, and still US influence was great enough to convene 100 countries in a global democracy summit last week. So it's not like the US is out of the game. But even if our influence erodes, Europe remains deeply committed, and there's some countries like Sweden and Norway, even more so, Denmark and so on. Germany is showing signs of, really caring about these issues. So at any given moment, you mobilize what international support you can and do your best to raise consciousness.
Thank you again, sir, for the great answer. And please let me read out another question. In democratic transition process, my question is how to overcome drawback of the democracy.
I missed the last part. Say again.
My question is how to overcome drawback of the democracy.
How to overcome? You mean how
in
to
democratic transition?
Within the country, how to overcome the drawback or
Yes.
failure of a democratic transition?
Oh.
Well, I'd say patience and persistence. Most countries don't get it right the first time. And one could say this is the second time in Burma. But, many countries have to go through repeated efforts to achieve or mobilize for democracy before it takes hold. So you need to have some faith in the future and some some kind of long-term perspective in order to recognize that you may not achieve this right away. It may take some time to achieve it, and you may be in a generational structure, and you may need to have some people on the inside and some people mobilizing support in other capitals. And you may need to build a long-term social media strategy and reflect on your mistakes and adapt and learn and use new technologies and new strategies where appropriate. I'd say there's no substitute for this hard work of patient, persistent education, mobilization, optimism about the future, dissemination of democratic values. It took several decades in Central and Eastern Europe for them to turn the corner to democracy. You just never know when it's going to happen.
Thank you, sir, for that great discussion. And we have got another question from the anonymous attendee. So that is, based on the current situations of Myanmar, which one might be the best way to reconstruct our country and to restore democracy? Violence against the Myanmar military, gender, or non-violence way to negotiate with the military and other related parties?
Well, I've already indicated in my lecture, which is got the better prospect. Violence, we published an article by Erica Chenoweth in the Journal of Democracy, which shows a lot of her research and that of colleagues shows that democratic transitions are about twice as likely to be successful when they're nonviolent as when they're violent. And I think, the mobilization of violence will just unify different elements of the military around the hardliners, around uh, uh, the current commander in chief. And I don't see where um, uh, an armed resistance would get the arms and the organization to defeat the armed forces of Myanmar. You know, China's not going to be helpful in this regard. And Thailand's not going to be helpful in this regard. Nobody, even if they don't like the Burmese generals particularly, nobody wants the model in the region. Not India, not Thailand, not Burma, not China. No one wants the model of a violent resistance overthrowing a regime. And so I think you're going to be very hard pressed if you mount a violent challenge to get the arms, the organization, the resources to do so successfully. And you know, the more you go down the violent path, the more you unify the regime, when I think the best prospect is to divide it. So, and you know, when you really play out the scenario of a full-scale civil war, you know, an armed struggle would probably be more likely to create a failed state, a Libya, a Syria, things like this, rather than a democracy. So I don't think it's a very good bet.
Thank you again, sir. The last question we have got from the anonymous, it is, do you think, can we restore democracy in Myanmar by negotiating between military gender, national unity government, and EAOs?
So again, I think I began to suggest that the best prospect lies in negotiation. But I don't think the military junta is going to negotiate unless they're, you know, under more pressure to do so than they are now. Now, I realize that's potentially a contradiction in what I said before, because one form of pressure is the violent resistance that the EAOs have been mobilizing for a very long time. But I don't think that's going to be effective in most of the country. I think that there's a missing actor here. You mentioned the military junta, the National Unity Government, and the EAOs. And, well, there's two missing actors. One is civil society, but you may imagine that as just the support group for the National Unity Government. But civil society on the ground in the country and the capacity to rally public opinion, even though obviously it's very difficult to organize in these circumstances, that is an important element. And the other missing element is the international community. And I think the international community needs to bring as much pressure to bear on the junta as possible. And the international community needs to make it clear that if they continue on this path, their country is just going to be, you know, semi swallowed up by China, and they don't really want that. So I think that a negotiation in which the national unity government, civil society, and the ethnic armed organizations create a kind of common front to negotiate with the military junta may be the best approach, but they need a push from the international community that would involve both carrots and sticks. The sticks are sanctions, and the carrots may be, economic benefits or whatever. If the junta negotiates a restoration of the constitutional order, I have to say here, and again, not happily, that I think if you think about it, probably the most you can hope for in the near term is to restore, some semblance of a constitutional semi-democracy in which, at least for the time being, the abridgments of democracy just have to be lived with. This doesn't make me happy at all, but I don't see what the international configuration would be that would be sufficient to pressure the military to, for example, agree, if it did restore the constitutional system, to agree to give up its seats in parliament. It'd be wonderful if they would do so, but it may be for a transitional period. You just need to live with this and try and get to a situation of normalcy where the military is not ruling, people are not living in fear, and there's some power sharing and accommodation. And then you hope that over time, this will gradually evolve. I say this in a very tentative way because it is not good to have a situation, not only in which Democrats have made very significant concessions that diminish democracy, but in which they've made further concessions that make the new system, a non-democracy or a hybrid regime is what we call it. But a hybrid or competitive authoritarian regime with some elements of authoritarianism, some elements of democracy, space for independent media, space for civil society, ability of people to move around and think and travel. That's a heck of a lot better than what exists now in terms of outright, military dictatorship, a republic of fear. And so I think if you could get back to that point through negotiations, it wouldn't be great, but it'd be better than what you have now, and maybe something that could be gradually built upon. Whether this is possible, I just don't know.
Thank you very much, sir, for your discussion and great suggestions on those questions. And if you don't mind, could you please cover one last question?
Okay.
The question is, was there any weakness from the Aung San Suu Kyi to prevent the coup?
That's an interesting question. I would have to be much better informed about the situation leading up to the coup than I am. And even then, I would be very reluctant to judge the decisions and actions of Da Aung San Suu Kyi. I think probably if you go through all of this, one could say, you know, she missed some signals of warning from the military. Maybe she overestimated her power and underestimated the willingness of the military to completely destroy the constitutional order. She may have judged that this couldn't happen, that the cost to the military of doing so would be too great. So I don't know that. It is possible that a very careful analysis of all of the signals and maneuvering and threats and the game, the political game that was being played in the months and weeks leading up to the coup might reveal that, you know, if she had made some different decisions and offered some far-reaching concessions, she might have averted the coup. But you know, first of all, the concessions would have been further diminishing the already, you know, semi-democracy that was in place. And second of all, I don't want to be in the position of blaming the victim. The military did something terrible and really criminal in overturning, in a very brutal way, the constitutional order that they had agreed to in implementing this transition. And personally, I think it was done out of greed for power on the part of the current ruler and a clique around him. But you know, I am not going to say, I'm not going to blame Aung San Suu Kyi for the coup. You can identify practical, tactical mistakes that she may have made that may have contributed to this, but I don't want to. I don't want to blame her. What I want to do is help her get out of jail and try and restart a process of democratic transition in Myanmar again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So today, I believe we have discussed a lot and covered enough for today's topic. And so due to the time constraint, so please let me end this webinar. And once again, thank you everyone for your active participation. And thank you, Professor, for your great discussions and for your time.
Okay. All right, good to be with you. I look forward to the time when it can be in person.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much, Larry.
Okay, Mia, take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.